Welcome to Global Media Network, LLC. Our motto is educate, enlighten, entertain. And today on Cool Your Heels with hosts, on our program, Lest We Forget, historical. P.S. That's what happens when you're doing more than 2 shows every week. Okay, on Lest We Forget Historical with host Lisa Skinner, Betsy Wurzel, and Lillian Cauldwell, we are going to discuss grieving when your spouse has Alzheimer's and after your spouse dies with Alzheimer's. And everybody knows that grieving is different for different people, and that you have to be careful before you make an ask you me or assumption about how people react emotionally. So we will begin first with Lisa Skinner, and then Betsy, and Lillian will sum it up, because since these 2 ladies have worked longer with Alzheimer's and dementia patients, they will have more information and tips to give you. Okay, here we go. Lisa, please begin.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for being with us again today. We just love you tuning in and listening to our shows. It really just motivates us and pumps us up for bringing you these series every week. So I brought with me today an article that I found on the internet about grieving. So I want to share it with you because it really touched me in a way that surprised me. So this is what I found. And it starts off by saying, holidays are never quite the same after someone we love dies. Even small aspects of a birthday or a Christmas celebration, an empty seat at the dinner table, one less gift to buy or make, can serve as jarring reminders of how our lives have been forever changed. Although these realizations are hard to face, clinical psychologist Mary Frances O'Connor, who wrote this, says we shouldn't avoid them or try to hide our feelings. She says, grief is a universal experience, and when we can connect, it is better. O'Connor, who is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Arizona, studies what happens in our brains. That's a coincidence.
Yeah, really. Who would have thought?
Yeah, when we experience grief. She says grieving is a form of learning, one that teaches us how to be in the world without someone we love in it. The background is running all the time for people who are grieving, thinking about new habits and how they will interact now after that someone passes on. Adjusting to the fact that we'll never again spend time with our loved ones can be very painful. It takes time and does involve changes in our brains. What we see in science is, if you have a grief experience and you have support, that you have a little bit of time to learn and confidence from people around you that you will, in fact, adapt to your loss. When we have the experience of being in a relationship, the sense of who we are is bound up with that other person. The word sibling, the word spouse implies 2 people. And so when the other person is gone, we suddenly have to learn a totally new set of rules to operate in the world. The we is as important as the you and me. And the brain, interestingly, really does encode it that way. So when people say, I feel like I've lost a part of myself, well, that's for a very good reason. The brain also feels that same way, as it were, the codes, the we, and much as the you and I. I'm going to put my glasses on so I can see the words better.
Take all the fun out of it.
Oh, yeah. Grief is that emotional state that just knocks you off your feet and comes over you like a wave. I totally agree with that. Grieving necessarily has a time component to it. Grieving is what happens as we adapt to the fact that our loved one is gone, that we're carrying the absence of them with us. And the reason that this distinction makes sense is grief is a natural response to loss, and that makes total sense. So we'll feel grief forever. A woman who lost her mother as a young person is going to experience that grief on her wedding day because it's a new moment where she's having to respond to the loss. But grieving, now I find this really compelling. Grieving means that our relationship to that grief changes over time. So she's saying there's a distinction between grief and grieving. So the first time, maybe even the first 100 times, you're knocked off your feet with grief. It feels terrible and awful and unfamiliar. But maybe the 101st time, you think to yourself, I hate this. I don't want this to be true, but I do recognize it and I do know that I will get through this wave. The range of emotions that someone experiences when they're grieving is a long a list as the range of emotions we have in any relationship. Commonly, there's panic, there's anxiety, there's sadness, and there's yearning. But what we sometimes forget is that there's also difficulty concentrating and confusion about what happens next. If you've ever been through this, and I have many times, I have personally experienced what we call that brain fog. And it's really when your brain just becomes overwhelmed with the grief that you're experiencing. She says, I am often struck by the intensity of the emotions. Grief is like someone turning up the volume dial all of a sudden. The emotion that I think often interferes with our relationships and friendships when we're grieving is anger, because anger feels so intense. You have someone blow up at a dinner party and you think, what's happening with them? And then to try to remember, oh yeah, they're grieving and everything is amped up a little bit. We have neuroimaging studies basically of grief, of the momentary reaction where you have that emotional yearning experience. There are less than a handful of studies, she tells us, looking at more than one moment in the same person across time. So looking at their grieving trajectory. What we know right now in these early days of the neurobiology of grief is really coming from snapshots. Having said that, one of the things that we know is that grief is tied to all sorts of different brain functions that we have, from being able to recall memories, to taking the perspective of another person, to even things like regulating our heart rate and the experience of pain and suffering. So lots of different parts of the brain are orchestrating this experience for you that we have when we feel grief. When you're knocked over by that wave of grief, you want to know, when will this end? From a research perspective, there is a very small proportion of people who might have what we now call prolonged grief disorder, something we start looking at about 6 months after our loss. And what we are seeing in such cases is that the person has not been able to function day to day the way they wished they could. And I think, Betsy, you can certainly address this when it's your turn. So can you, Lillian. I know that.
Oh, yeah.
They're not getting out the door to work or getting dinner on the table for their kids, or they're not able to say, listen to music because it's just too upsetting to them. So these types of concerns suggest it would be helpful to intervene and get them back on the healing trajectory where they will still feel grief, but they will adapt to it differently. The older term they used to call what was complicated grief. And although prolonged grief disorder is the term that the psychologists have settled on, there's a reason that she likes the term complicated. And it's because it makes you think of complications. With COVID, the loved ones that are left behind made the sacrifice of not being with their loved ones in the hospital in order to stop the spread. And that sacrifice definitely needs to be recognized. They did something for the greater good. As an example, one of those is grief-related rumination that people sometimes experience. The better term for that, people will recognize, is and we've all said this, woulda, shoulda, coulda thoughts that run through your brain. And they just roll through your head over and over again. The problem with these thoughts, and we sometimes call these counterfactual, is that they all end up in this virtual scenario where the person didn't really die. And that's just not reality. And so, by spinning in these thoughts, not only is there no answer for you, there are an infinite number of possibilities with no actual answer that would have happened, but it also isn't necessarily helping us to adapt to that painful reality that they really did pass away. And so our virtual version is not really helping us to learn how to be in the world now. It's less than 10% of people who experience prolonged grief disorder. And what that means is 90% of people experience difficult grief and suffering, but don't have a disorder after losing a loved one. That's encouraging. I think it's so important to remember that because we don't want to hide grief away in a psychiatrist's office or a counselor's office, except in indications where that would be helpful to get people back on track. I think when you care for someone who is going through this terrible process of losing someone, it really is more about listening to them and seeing where they're at in their learning than it is about trying to make them feel better. That's an interesting point. And Betsy, you and I were having that conversation right before we started recording that you're going to share with the audience. And I think it is so important to bring what you told me up. I'm looking forward to hearing you tell the audience what we talked about. She says the point is not to cheer them up. The point is to be with them and let them know that you will be with them and that you can imagine a future for them when they're not constantly being knocked over by those waves of grief. I think that was a pretty touching article. It was published by NPR on KQED, and the author was Burley McCoy, as she interviewed the psychologist. So I really wanted to share this with you because I thought it was really a unique way of describing grief to people, which is so different from all the other resources that I found on the internet where they're telling you, you got to go through these 5 stages of grief. And it was just really a different perspective. And one of the reasons why Lillian and Betsy and myself wanted to talk to you about the grieving process is because, especially with Alzheimer's disease and other related dementia that are caused by other brain diseases, we have mentioned many, many times, because all 3 of us have been through it. We've all interviewed and counseled so many families about this process. But the thing that really throws a wrench into people's lives when they have a loved one going through Alzheimer's disease or another brain disease is they really have to experience this loss twice. Once while the person is still living, but they're fading away into a completely different world when they lose themselves and they no longer recognize their loved ones and they can't communicate. And then again, upon their passing. So we as the survivors really have to process this loss twice. So it's a double whammy for all of us. And I think that some of the advice that this psychologist has given us in her article can be very, very helpful and healing for us to be able to understand what we're going through a little deeper. So that said, I'm going to turn the floor over to Lillian, and she'll take it from here. Thanks.
Thank you. One of the things about grieving that nobody, your mom, your dad, do not take you aside and say, when somebody dies, this is how you're going to react. This is how you're going to handle it. And I think it's